Om Asato Ma Satkamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravirmagethi Rudrayate Dakshinam Mukham Tena Mam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. Our subject today is a voice without a form. That's how Swami Vivekananda once described himself. So we just had a July 4th celebration, and we know what July 4th stands for. But the date has another significance in the Vedanta movement, because that was the day Swami Vivekananda passed away, or he chose the day to go away, as his teacher, Sri Ramakrishna, had predicted. That we read in his life that after he attained that supreme samadhi, Nirvikalpa samadhi, which is considered the culmination of spiritual enlightenment, Sri Ramakrishna said, and it's kind of put in a very symbolical language, he said, the realization that you have received will be now, I'm locking it up, and the key will be given to you after you have a lot more work to do. And after you have finished the work, that key will be given to you and you can reclaim the realization you had. And he also told his other disciples that Naren, that is what was Vivekananda's pre-monastic name, he said once Naren knows who he truly is, he will refuse to live in this body even for a moment. And so this was kind of known among his the disciples of Ramakrishna and others. So sometime in 1902, someone asked him, kind of half jokingly, half seriously, Swamiji, do you now know who you are? And Swamiji seriously said, yes. And then we read in his life, there's just total silence. And then just within a few days, we see that he asked for the almanac, wanted to see. He didn't tell anybody what he was seeing in it. But it's generally been in the tradition that those who have this ability to choose the time of their passing would kind of choose an auspicious day. So that's how he was looking at it. And of course, the English date was July 4th, 1902. And the date according to the lunar calendar, whatever it was, I don't know that. So he chose this day, so that's why 4th of July is also significant date in Swami Vivekananda's life as well. And I thought, therefore, since it is so close to July 4th that we are meeting this morning, it'll be interesting to reflect on a little bit about Swami Vivekananda's life. While he described himself as a voice without a form, that's not necessarily how others have described him. And over the years, many books, articles, even PhD theses have been written about his life, his philosophy, his teachings. And people have tried to see him, tried to understand him in many different ways. And so it'll be interesting to see what kind of epithets were kind of stuck on him or projected on him, and why it was thought to be so. And that's the kind of a challenge we might see about really any amongst us, but especially so these great ones. While we know their biographical details, because there are so many biographies written about him, but we also know that a person's life is more than simply a bunch of dates, like when they were born and when they passed away, and some of the interesting incidents in their lives. the totality of a person's life is more than simply these details. And to try to understand the person beyond these dates and incidents, that's always a challenge. And how we understand them or how we look upon them is also a reflection about how our mind is able to interpret and understand whatever it is that we know about them. And so, if Vivekananda's life were to be described in a single phrase or a word, how would it be done? It's been done in by many different ways. So in India, for instance, one of the epithets that is almost always attached to him, they call him the patriot saint. Vivekananda, in fact, some of the biographies call Vivekananda the patriot saint of India. Now, the word patriotism is kind of troubling in some ways. It has come to mean many different things to many people, sometimes in a very positive way, sometimes in a kind of rather limited and restrictive way. So, if Vivekananda is seen as a patriot, it's also important to understand what kind of patriotism can be attributed to him. One thing that we see throughout his life, that his love for, the patriotism obviously includes India, that's where he was born. That's what many, and there is a kind of a little bit of a provincialism involved here, because Indians are proud that he's like our person. And so that's how they like to think of him, as a patriot. And yes, there's no doubt Swami Vivekananda loved India. But what was his love for India based on? And on his life we see that what he always focused on, that the wisdom, the spiritual wisdom that has been passed on from one generation to the next through several thousands of years, and how much that wisdom was necessary for our generations now, not only for Indians, but also for the rest of the world. And it is that treasure that India had, that was the primary focus of his love. And that is why he encouraged Indians to study the Gita, to study the Upanishads. Because sometimes we might see that in our own lives. We can be so proud of something just because it is connected to our life or our roots in some way, but not really make any effort to try to know it, try to understand it. And so Swami Vivekananda was aware of that tendency in human beings. So he pushed people in India to study your own texts first before boasting about it, before being proud about the great spiritual wisdom we have. Because sometimes we may boast about the things we have without really knowing any intricacies of those ourselves. It's also true that, and especially in the kind of times in which we live today, the word patriot or patriotism often drags people into politics. And that is what many try to do to Swamiji also. Swami Vivekananda is generally, of course, the word Swamiji now gets used to monks in general, but in the Vedanta movement, generally here, when we say Swamiji, it always means Swami Vivekananda. So, at the time of Swamiji, India was under British rule. It wasn't a politically free country. And therefore, a lot of the statements that Swamiji made, and he had become such a big celebrity after the Parliament of Religions, that his words, people, as they sometimes do today, people can twist the words of these famous people and to use it to their advantage. And so something like that had happened during Swamiji's time as well. And so he wrote to one of his students in Madras, his name was Alasinga Perumal, and this is what Swamiji wrote. One thing I find in the books of my speeches and sayings published in Calcutta, some of them are printed in such a way as to savor of political views, whereas I am no politician or political agitator. I care only for the spirit, When that is right, everything will be right by itself. And so Swamiji was very actively made sure that his name was somehow not dragged and or connected with any specific political movement. On another occasion, he wrote to the same student, he said, I do not believe in politics. God and truth are the only politics in the world. Everything else is trash. In London, when a journalist once asked Swami Vivekananda whether he had given any attention to the Indian National Congress movement, that was the big political movement of those days, and Swamiji replied, I cannot claim to have given any interest, any attention to that. My work is in a different part of the field. Now, that doesn't mean Swamiji was indifferent to the freedom struggle, but he was never directly involved into it himself. But his words and his teachings became a source of great inspiration for many freedom fighters in India. During the freedom struggle, he told his students in India, when again they tried to kind of narrow his field, because so many times Swami Vivekananda, when he came to the West, when he came to America here in 1893, and as most of you are aware, that when he came here, he was virtually an unknown monk. So much so that there wasn't even any chance that he would be allowed to speak at the Parliament of Religions. He wasn't even registered as a delegate. Through a set of coincidences, you could say, or divine plan, as some others might say, it just worked out that he was finally able to go and speak there. And then overnight, he became a celebrity. He stayed in this country for 3 or 4 years, and he returned to India in 1897. A lot of people in India then had thought that after he became famous, and they had this very exaggerated way it was described in the media, Vivekananda goes and conquers the West and so on. And they found he's still continuing to teach here in the West. And many of them wrote to him, what are you doing there? Come back. This is your field of work. Return to India and do the work here. And that time, Swamiji, wrote to his students in India, you must not forget that my interests are international and not Indian alone. He also wrote in a letter, as for me, mind you, I stand at nobody's dictation. I know my mission in life and no chauvinism about me. I belong as much to India as to the world. No humbug about that. What country has any claim on me? Am I any nation's slave? And that's what makes some of these great people so difficult to understand. And one side you see his immense love for India. At the same time, resistance, if anyone tries to limit him only to some one particular part of the world, while he sees himself as identified with a much larger landscape. And similarly, when you speak about patriot saints, Swamiji's sainthood also was not very conventional, since he was very different in many ways from what we generally associate with a kind of a typical saint. In southern India, in Madras, he occasionally used to wrestle with some of the youngsters. His well-built physique acquired for him the name, locally is called Pahalwan Swami, means a wrestler monk. Again, not something that most saints are known to do. Again, in southern India, during his wandering days in a place called Belgaum, he shocked his host one day by asking for betel and tobacco. Again, not something that Orthodox monks do. And so when they questioned him, how a holy person like you have not been able to give up? Because these things are considered as kind of comforts of life, or pleasurable things in life, tobacco and betel leaves and so on. And so Swamiji's reply was, he said he found it impossible to give up some of these habits which he had even before he underwent his transformation under the grace of his guru. But he said, since these habits were of no great consequence, he just let them remain. And that's important. Not that, I'm not saying that he didn't recommend everyone must have tobacco. That's not what he said. But it's important to know, where does real spirituality lie? Because sometimes we might be so fanatical about some of these superficial things in life. Oh, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. While some of the more essential characteristics necessary for spiritual life may be neglected. So it's not enough to say, oh, I'm a complete vegetarian and I do this and I go to a temple every day and I meditate every day. And at the same time, I go out and I cheat, I'm selfish, I get angry with people. And I can't simply say just because I'm a vegetarian or I'm not these things, that's what makes me spiritual. And that's what Swamiji showed, that there are essentials in spiritual life and there are non-essentials. Essentials is something that, well, essentials. As to non-essentials, that's really up to us, whether we want to let them go or let them remain. So that's about one of the ways some people have tried to see Swamiji as a patriot saint. There are some others who see him with a different epithet. And it's clear, while the term Swamiji's love for India and his patriotism might mean a lot to people in India, people of Indian origin, it really doesn't mean much to people outside India. Whether Swamiji loved India or not, or he was a patriotic or not, it doesn't strike so much a chord, say, in the West. So many of his Western disciples and friends, oftentimes they referred to him as a prophet. They saw him as a prophet with a mission. Once Swami Vivekananda is reported to have said, I have a message for the West as Buddha had a message for the East. And it's kind of an interesting contrast. We see that the Buddha never went outside India, that all of his teachings were given actually not even in the entirety of the Indian subcontinent. It's a pretty narrow geographical area in which the Buddha preached. So his teaching was given in the East, and as we see now, it has kind of spread all over the world, including the West. So while his teaching was given in the East and spread to the West, in Vivekananda's case, it actually happened completely opposite. Swamiji's teaching, he became known only when he came to the West. Most of the teaching he has given, the 9 volumes of his complete works that we have, majority of that, the lectures, writing, all of those things were actually given in the West. So his teachings were given in the West, and it's from here they have spread toward the East. Even Indians came to know about Vivekananda more after he was recognized by the West. That's why sometimes someone remarked, Vivekananda is America's greatest gift to India. Because when he moved about in India, not many people knew him. To Alasinga Perumal, the same student from Madras, Swamiji once wrote in a letter, he said, what he described as his own life's work. He said, to put the Hindu ideas into English and then make out of dry philosophy and intricate mythology and startling psychology a religion which shall be simple, popular, and at the same time meet the requirements of the highest minds, is a task only those can understand who have attempted it. The dry, abstract non-duality, Advaita, must become living, poetic in everyday life. Out of hopelessly intricate mythology must come concrete moral forms, and out of bewildering yogiism must come the most scientific and practical psychology. And all this must be put in a form so that a child may grasp it. That is my life's work. And those who have made a study of his complete works, his lectures, and even the smaller books of his that we have, they're deceptively simple in some ways. When we try to reflect on his words, we see how much high philosophy has been expressed in such a simple way, in a way that you and I can understand. That's what distinguishes the teachers of the highest category from ordinary teachers. Ordinary teachers make simple things more complicated. And these great teachers make difficult things, abstract things, very simple. If you look at the stories that the Buddha told, the parables that Jesus taught, you read the conversations of Ramakrishna, all of these great teachers, when they speak, they don't teach like a professor, like some they're doing some PhD thesis or something like that. But what they speak is the highest truth, but in a very simple, easy to understand language. And sometimes it's when you look at the books, for instance, as simple a book as The Practice of the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence. When you read it, it just feels as if, oh, this is something I can start doing right now. And yes, we can. But only when we actually start practicing it, we realize how tough it is. And so, while the simplicity of the teaching is helpful, we also have to be aware that just because there is something we can understand intellectually doesn't necessarily automatically imply that we are immediately going to be able to live it every moment of our lives. But that's the practice. But first is to understand the teaching and then to try to live that teaching. The third way that some people have tried to understand Swami Vivekananda, that they just see the defining characteristic of his life as someone who truly loved the poor, loved the masses. Swami Vivekananda once said, "May I be born again and again and suffer thousands of miseries so that I may worship the only God that exists, the only God I believe in, the sum total of all souls, and above all, my God the wicked, my God the poor of all races, of all species, is the special object of my worship." This is a very, very inspiring quote. And sometimes I wondered about this. This he wrote in a letter. We can understand the God, my God, the poor of all races and all species, because yes, the love for the poor and the underprivileged, and is been expressed in many ways by these great ones. What does it mean, my God, the wicked? And that requires a real deep insight, because one of the things that we generally tend to do is it's easy to see the divine in that which is good and kind and loving, and and that's wonderful. But then we have this other half of our human experience, which is not so good, which is terrible, in fact. And then we say, if this is where God shines, then who shines in that other part? And to be able to see that even in this terrible ways that nature and people might manifest their whatever they do, their power and so on, that somehow it's the divine shining through, not only in what we call what is good, but even perhaps what is wicked and bad. It's like depending on the material through which the light is being transmitted, the more twisted a mirror is, the reflection is going to be twisted as well. And the mirror is clean and transparent, we'll have a different kind of a reflection. In the same way, the light of the divine shines through everyone, and shines, of course, more brightly and peacefully, and it can bring a great joy when that light is reflected through a pure and good mind. But the same light is also being reflected by some of the terrible minds in the world. Now, that doesn't make that mind bad or good. It's just to recognize that the distortion is in the reflecting medium, while the light itself is one and the same. And therefore, it needs a little bit of nuance to understand that if we want to take the totality of existence, then it may not be a good idea to limit the divine only to the one half of it, that which we consider good. And that's why the way Vedanta tries to understand this phenomenon, they see that good and bad, these polarities, good, bad, love, hatred, they all belong to this relative world. That rather than limiting the divine to only one side of it, it's more helpful to think of the divine which transcends both good and evil. Yes, of course, we must always choose good over evil, but ultimately the goal is to go beyond the transcendence. Really means not simply transcending evil. Evil cannot be transcended. Evil has to be destroyed. But when we have been able to eliminate evil from our lives, then the question becomes, what am I going to do with all this good that I have? And at that stage, even the goodness can become a burden. And that the example that is often given in the text is between being bound in a gold chain and in a rusted iron chain. Well, yes, is being bound in a gold chain better? Maybe, or perhaps not. You're still bound. And so good and bad is a little bit like that. It's good to be good, but it's better to even go beyond goodness. And that's why throughout the Vedantic texts, we read that the goal is to try to eliminate evil. Because sometimes the question might come that if we have to transcend everything, then why try to destroy evil? Just transcend them all together at the same time. And the answer is that no, we cannot. We cannot transcend evil. As long as the evil is in the heart, we have to eliminate it. But when only good remains, the dharma, in the Sanskrit word for that is dharma and adharma. So adharma or evil has to be removed. But once that dharma or goodness remains, then that dharma has to be transcended. That the divine, the truth, is beyond both this, beyond the polarity of good and evil. Before Swami Vivekananda came to the West in 1893, he met his brother disciples, Swami Brahmananda and Swami Turiyananda, in a place called Mount Abu in western India. So he said to them, and this was just a few days before he sailed for America. He said, I've traveled all over India, but alas, it was agony to me, my brothers, to see the terrible poverty of the masses, and I could not restrain my tears. It is now my firm conviction that to preach religion to them without trying to remove their poverty and suffering is futile. It is for this reason, to find means for the salvation of the poor of India, that I am going to America. And then turning to Turiyananda, he said with profound sorrow and intense emotion, Hari Bhai, I am still unable to understand anything of your so-called religion, but my heart has expanded very much, and I have learned to feel. Believe me, I intensely feel. Even after his success at the Parliament of Religions, in fact, we have this description in his life that the day when he became so famous, and the next day the papers were, all the headlines proclaimed his name, and we have those clippings from those newspapers even today. That night, Swamiji said he just couldn't sleep in the comfortable bed he had in Chicago, and he could not lay himself in bed, rolled on the floor in agony and despair, crying, "Oh mother, what do I care for name and fame when my motherland remains sunk in utmost poverty? To what a sad pass have we poor Indians come when millions of us die for want of a handful of rice, and here they spend millions of rupees upon their personal comforts. Who will raise the masses of India? Who will give them bread? Show me, O mother, how I can help them." And it is this love for the poor, love for the underprivileged, that has been the source of all the service activities that the Vedanta societies do all over the world. Swamiji said, I am poor and I love the poor. Once, actually, when he was in New York, he had rented a place and he was going to give classes. And some of his close friends, who fairly people of good means, they advised, because he was still, I mean, he come from India, and they were there to kind of help him, support him, tell him about the way things are done in the West. And so when he had decided to give classes in some locality in New York City, his close friends suggested, no, that's not the right place to start giving classes. They said, the right sort of people won't come if you give your classes there. And Swamiji was furious when they used that kind of language. And Swamiji said, the only right sort of people are those whom the Lord sends. That is what I understand in my life's experience. They alone can and will help me. As for the rest, Lord, help them in a mass and save me from them. Truce to this right sort of presentation. Thou art my right, thou art my wrong, my Shiva. After he returned to India in 1897, he gave a talk in the temple, the very famous ancient Shiva temple in Rameshwaram in southern India. And this is what he told the assembled gathering. This is the gist of all worship, to be pure and to do good to others. He who sees Shiva in the poor, in the weak, and in the diseased really worships Shiva. And if he sees Shiva only in the image, his worship is but preliminary. So this is another way people have tried to understand Vivekananda, someone who truly loved the poor, loved the underprivileged. And then there's this other aspect of Vivekananda that appeals to many of his students, that Vivekananda as a divine being. We read from his life, Sri Ramakrishna once described that he had a mystical vision when he saw a young child go up into these celestial worlds and found there 7 sages, 7 rishis, deep meditation. This is what gets described in many Indian books as Saptarishi, the 7 rishis. And so in his vision, Ramakrishna saw that this young baby goes to one of those rishis and says, I'm going down and you must come with me too. And then when Narendranath was born in 1863, Sri Ramakrishna confirms that one of those rishis is now born as Narendra. And he later confirmed, of course, that baby was he himself. And we can understand, because some of these things appear very strange when we look at it without knowing the background story to this. The first visit of Vivekananda as a young man, he was then barely 18 or 19 years old. And he goes to Dakshineshwar. That is his first meeting with Ramakrishna. And then Ramakrishna says, you came so late. How could you be so unkind as to keep me waiting so long? And then he takes him in that adjacent porch area and then stands before him with folded hands and addressed him, Lord, I know you are that ancient sage Nara, the incarnation of Narayana, born on earth to remove the miseries of mankind. This poor 18-year-old kid, he is terrified at this. And he's just wondering, have I come to the right place? So in the beginning, even Vivekananda just couldn't understand this. What attracted him to Ramakrishna? Sometimes these words like this were bewildering, but what attracted to him was this utter purity of his life, the simplicity, the purity, and he kept on going, and then gradually he began to understand what Ramakrishna's life and personality meant. After Sri Ramakrishna's Mahasamadhi in 1886, when the Holy Mother went to stay at Kamarpukur, she had a remarkable vision in which, so this is Holy Mother's vision, she saw Ramakrishna approaching her, followed by Narendra, Baburam, Rakhal, these are the disciples, first generation of disciples of Ramakrishna. From Ramakrishna's feet gushed forth a stream of water which moved before him in waves. This is Mother's vision. The mother thought to herself, I see that he himself is everything, from his blessed feet springs the Ganga. She plucked a handful of flowers and offered them into these Ganges. She then saw the master disappearing into the body of Narendra. Swami Brahmananda also said that he had a premonition of Swamiji's Mahasamadhi days before it actually occurred, because as he told the other monks at Belur Math, every time he looked at Swamiji, he saw Sri Ramakrishna living in him. So there was this deep mystical side in Sri Ramakrishna's life. Sometimes the Vivekananda, the famous celebrity at the Parliament of Religions, the great orator, the thundering Advaita teacher, the oratorical flourish of Vivekananda is sometimes so dramatic in many ways that people just hold on to that without seeing that behind all of that was this deep mystical side to Vivekananda's life. He rarely spoke about that in public. If we study his life carefully, we get glimpses of that. And that's something that often gets missed in a kind of a superficial study of Vivekananda's life. So with all these different viewpoints that people have about him, Vivekananda's own description of himself was none of these things. He just spoke of himself as a voice without a form. And again, that's something can be a point of reflection for all of us. What does it even mean, a voice without a form? And one way to understand that is that throughout eternity, the voice of the divine comes to us. It's continuing, even now it is coming to us. But it becomes audible only after it is passed through, it's filtered through our own mind. Because everything that we understand, everything that we hear, comes through the equipment that we have, the body and mind. And since that voice gets filtered differently, we all have a mind, and that mind is colored in many different ways with our own biases, on our prejudices, our own way of understanding things. So when all of us are hearing the same voice of the divine, but when it enters us, it gets filtered in different ways. And because of that, when we try to understand these great ones, we understand them very differently. When our minds become completely crystal clear, then we will hear that voice of the divine as it is. And then we will perhaps be able to understand, look at Vivekananda and see what is really meant by saying a voice without a form. And finally, even as we see that Vivekananda was seen by different people in different ways and how he saw himself, in our own little way, we can look at our own lives and see that maybe so many biographies about us will not be written the way they have been written about Vivekananda. But still, amongst our family and friend circles, just like we have impressions about the people around us, and sometimes we might even have a single phrase description about, oh, this person is like this, that person is like that. It might be helpful to see, because we already know how we see other people around us. But sometimes it's helpful to be a little bit aware of, how do other people see me? Now, it doesn't really matter how other people see me, because really you can't control how other people see us. But an important question would be, how would I like other people to see me? If after I die, and if there is anyone who still remembers me, how would I want them to remember me as? And most importantly, how do I see myself? Who am I? Again, whatever I said earlier about Vivekananda's life is in some way true with our own life as well. What is my life? We know when we were born. We don't know yet when we will die. And many of us don't want to know. We know the kind of things that have happened in our life. So who am I as a person? beyond this bunch of experiences I've had in life, some successes, some failures, some friends, and all of these different incidents, is that all? Am I just, is me as a person, just a collection of all these experiences? Or who am I really? And I think that's a question really worth asking. Who would I like to be? What is my idea of an ideal person? And one of the reasons, of course, we study Vivekananda, Ramakrishna, Jesus, Buddha, all of these great ones is because we find some reflection of the ideal in them. And the reason we find them inspiring is, in some form, we would want to have that ideal reflected in our own life. It's not enough to simply admire these people. That admiration will have some value if somehow a little bit of that purity, that greatness, anything that makes their life so valuable, some of that value enters into my own life. And so an occasional self-appraisal might be to say, me as a person, everything that I have learned in life, everything that I am inspired by, in what way has it changed me? Has it made me a better person? We may not have so much control over whether other people are happy with us, but at least we can say, am I happy with myself? What should I do? Do I need to make any changes in the way I think, the way I speak, the way I do things, the way I relate with other people around me? Is there a scope for improvement so that I feel better about myself? And that's the kind of thought I would like to emphasize on as we gather this morning. That's something that can be helpful, because spiritual life is more than simply doing a little bit of prayer in the morning and a little bit of prayer in the evening. That's good, that's important. But ultimately, what it boils down to is how I as a person, how has it changed me? And if it has changed me, hopefully for the better, but where would I want it to go? We don't want our lives to become stagnated, to become static. Every day we have to keep on moving, because if we don't go higher, then chances are we are going down. And so we have to continuously keep on moving. And study of Vivekananda's life gives us that impetus to think about the ideal, to think what that ideal means to us and what we need to do to reach that ideal. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu.